today. So it's you know, we want to have conversation with people, but you have to ask yourself as a leader, have I earned the right by trust to have tough conversations with my people? And because if you haven't, then that's probably what you need to start building that before you can start jumping into. I mean, it'd be very awkward to walk up to somebody today you've never had a conversation with about anything of any significance and say, hey, what do you think? What do you feel about, you know, police officers killing unarmed black men in America? Well, that's probably, we don't have that relationship. You and I can't have that conversation, but we've never talked about anything tough before. So I think it's really important to build that with more rapport. And the last thing I'm going to share is, this is crazy. What would who would have ever thought 2020 would have ended up the way it did, right? So a year with so much promise, this literally goes off the cliff, right? The world, we are living in the twilight zone. But we have to be able to share with people our positive vision of the future, right? So this is bad, right? This is bad. Everything that's going on is tough, but you know, the sun is going to shine tomorrow. It is going to get better. We're doing things to make it better. So when people ask me, I always try to share my vision of the future, especially in regards to what's happening in public policing in America. I tell people, man, I look forward to the day when everybody is treated with dignity and respect by police officers, and everybody respects police officers appropriately, and every single citizen interaction with police officers doesn't end up in somebody dying, right? You know, it doesn't end up with somebody dying. It ends up with the appropriate response, right? Whether the person goes to jail or goes home, the response is appropriate. And because, you know, when you call the police, nobody should really die when you call the police. That's a bad thing. We have to get away from that. So I talked too long. I apologize. So that's my answer to the question.
No, that's great, Roy. I so much appreciate your perspective, given your background and as a policeman, as a black man, as a leader here with us. So thank you. You mentioned about relationships, and that's something that takes time. But we have to remember that as well as timing is also very important, because silence is, like you said, is deafening and it's not helping. Any comment from the other panelists that if you would like to comment before we move on?
Yeah, Marcos, I would like to add something. You know, Roy brought some really good conversation about trust, and the recent events in the U.S. have made me think a lot of who I am in my community, who I am at work, who I am at my house, at home, with my kids, with my family. And the reality is, like, even me, you know, mid-40s, it makes me think that I could have probably been better. I have not been the best that I could have been. And, you know, so I was foreign born. I was born in Peru. And I remember came to college in the US. And during my times in college, all we were taught was how to be politically correct. That was our approach. And when I look back, and I think that way of thinking of the world has really almost forced us to be passive. You know, be politically correct, be passive. I think as we see these events everywhere, I mean, they're really not just in the US, let's be honest. I think that as leaders, we need to be prescriptive. You know, we need to be intentional. We need to talk about our differences. We need to be inquisitive. I think as leaders, we also need to listen more. I mean, sometimes we have to accept that we're ignorant to a situation. But in order to get trust, just following what Roy mentions, we need to seek that knowledge. You know, we need to try to discover that diversity that is going to bring the best of all of us. If we as leaders, we don't prescribably go after it, if we're not inquisitive, if we don't sit, even if we're uncomfortable, if we don't open our mind, and sometimes open our mind is about listening so that people can trust and we can talk and elaborate and build up on it, nothing is going to change. So those are some of the thoughts that have been in my head in the last few days.
Wow, that is true. When you're politically correct, yeah, that kind of stops conversations on its tracks as well. So there's a fine balance. Warren, go ahead. I know you want to say something.
Yes, I was going to say that, and I just want to humbly just acknowledge my limitations in this conversation. That firstly, we struggle to have the conversation, and when I say we, I mean the proverbial we, because we don't practice having the conversation consistently. Racism is not something that just pops up now and then. It is a constant presence. And so because we haven't necessarily consciously considered it consistently in our, we haven't developed the stamina and the skills to really go into that conversation. So what I wanted to do is just use this period of time to talk about two things that I think are really, really important, especially for folks who are saying things like all lives matter. Why, blue lives matter? Why do we say Black lives matter? So that's the first thing I wanted to quickly talk about. Then I wanted to talk about a managerial strategy. That's really important. So one of the things that's so critical as leaders is to hold these tensions in your hands, if you will. That yes, all lives matter is correct. We all matter. We all have inherent value. Blue lives, police officers in different contexts put themselves in danger, and that is, their lives matter. They are human beings. But in this moment, in the presence of racism, Black lives matter because Black lives are being snuffed out by racism. So by saying that Black lives matter, you're not saying that all lives don't matter or blue lives don't matter. What you're saying is, in this moment, we need to have a very specific focus on the lives that are not being mattered equally, okay? So it's okay to say Black lives matter, and you're not disputing anything else, right? It's okay to be in that. I just want to hold that tension for us. The second thing is, as a manager, it's really critically important to understand where you are. You may have become aware of the presence of racism last week, okay? But this is historical, okay? And so one of the things you want to avoid, and I just want to walk through some steps, one of the things you want to avoid is to go into that conversation having not reflected on yourself and processed your information with somebody you trust, okay? This is not the time to go to a Black colleague and talk about your awareness of racism, right? This is not that time. So reflect on yourself, reflect on your emotions, and process those first. The second thing is, go into the conversation with a strategy, and that strategy is to listen and to really reflect and listen with the person, not to put yourself, not to say things like, I can't imagine how you feel, not to make yourself the center of the conversation, but to really create an opportunity to authentically listen and find avenues to support that person in the moment. So those are some quick things I just wanted to throw out there for those who are thinking, how do I do this? We have some resources on Genesis that can help you walk through those, and we have some trainings planned along in the way to help managers work through those conversations.
Excellent. Kimberly, I think you're on mute.
Oh.
No, you are on mute. You're on mute. I think you want to say something.
Oh, well, everything that has been said, I can't agree with it more. One thing that Roy said that really stuck out to me is the idea of empathy. And, if it started with a C, it might have been in my earlier presentation. But empathy is, I think, so critical here because what it really shows is that, I don't have to agree with you or to agree with your perspective to recognize that you have one. And so I think sometimes leaders shy away from these conversations because they can be difficult, because people have different perspectives across the board on some of these very difficult and tough issues. And that you may not share some of the same perspective as some of your associates. But again, I go back to that empathy of, I don't have to agree with your perspective to recognize that you have one. And that as we talk about, you hear HR professionals say, bring your whole self to work, and allowing people to bring their whole selves to work. You can't really check these things at the door, these personal things at the door. These are things that people are grappling with and affect them deeply right now in our society. And so I think that's one thing. The other thing is that recognizing that people are in different places in their journey on these topics and these issues. And, I say that and I know that, but just this week, I had a real experience with that in a conversation that I was having with my husband, who's a Black man, and realizing that he and I had very different experiences growing up. We grew up in the same small town, Texarkana, Texas, East Texas. We're both African American, but we had vastly different experiences in how we saw the world and how we believe the world saw us growing up. And so, he said he had never experienced racism until college. And I said, well, I remember being called the N-word when I was 9 years old. And I remember exactly where I was when that happened. And I just kind of thought that was a global experience for many people, but that wasn't his experience. And so I think that, part of this is just understanding that we all have different journeys. We all have we're the sum total of our life experiences, and we're all and accepting that and listening, like Warren said, about being willing to listen to different perspectives and different journeys. And then the other piece of it is, again, being able to have those hard conversations, and where you don't feel equipped to have those hard conversations. Hetty is here to help assist with that, and I know that they're going to be sharing some additional resources to help guide those conversations, because really people again are bringing their whole selves to work. We want them to bring their whole selves to work, and you can't check some of these things at the door. And I will tell you, I am guilty of not doing that. Some years ago, we had another incident where a Black man was killed. Unarmed Black man was killed at the hands of a police officer, and we had the police deaths here, the tragic police deaths here in Dallas. And during that time, there was just a tension in the air, and there was an argument, and with a couple of associates that turned physical, actually, and about this idea of Black Lives Matter. And I remember watching the news in our break room, what we call the park here, and it was on, and people were kind of making comments at lunch about it, and clearly on different sides of this issue. And so, long story short, as a leadership team, I remember us deciding to change the channel in the break room from the news, which was showing 24/7, and now we have 24/7 HGTV. And at the time, we were like, we just want people to be happy and think about renovating their houses at work. We don't want this tension. We don't want to feed into it. And we really thought we were making the right decision. And again, I was part of that decision, and said we need to, I think we focused on the Olympics. So this was probably 4 years ago. And we just showed Olympics all day, which was great. And then after that, we just decided, let's just see what Chip and Joanna Gaines are doing all day, every day. Because we want people to be happy. But now I look back at that, and I think, that was a missed opportunity to address some of the hurt and some of the frustration that our associates have. And so, again, I think there's opportunity there as leaders to show that empathy and to engage in some of those difficult conversations.
That's great. Thank you. What I hear throughout is how important it is for this whole self-reflection, for us to understand where we're at, because as folk bring themselves, their whole selves to work, guess what? There might be some tension there for us as leaders, as people, talk to us, are open, tell us their stories, and we have no other choice but to value people. And I think that's where the tension comes, as to how do I got to understand where I'm at, So when I hear these stories, I learn to value them and appreciate people, because at the end of the day, that acceptance is what's going to move us forward. So thank you. Thank you. I have another question. As current and future CHRISTUS executives, what does being anti-racist look like in our leadership roles? Jewel, do you mind grabbing that one, or should I?
No, that's fine. You know, I mean, honestly, just trying to process all the conversations we had. But,
Yeah.
you know, at the end of the day, I mean, being anti-racist, you know, it's past that typical answer, I see no color, right? It's past that. It's about embracing. I mean, I hear a lot the word empathy. Kimberly mentioned it quite a few times, and I think it's so important to kind of grab onto that concept of empathy. I think that I go back to what is it that we're trying to do, and I think if we're thinking about what being non-racist means, I mean, let's apply it to work, right? It's about cultivating a diverse and inclusive workplace, you know. And I mentioned that we have to be intentional, you know. Culture of companies does not happen by accident. You know, we're all responsible for it. We might not be perfect, but we have to believe that a better workplace is good for everybody. When I try, you know, it's an interesting conversation because, you know, I have kids. I want to make sure that they grow up in an environment when things are better. And I think things are always gonna be better if we put our minds to it. And I go back to how, I mean, you asked the question, what does that look like? And I think at work, what we need to do, the answer is pretty clear, right? We have to make sure as leaders that every member of CHRISTUS has that feeling of belonging, that they belong to the organization. I think that by doing that in a very intentional way, we are going to be able to make each member be able to unlock their full potential. You know, I think that it's only when every member of CHRISTUS feels valued, we can truly improve outcomes. But we gotta go back to that. You know, it's hard. We gotta try. We can't. It won't happen by chance. If we need to be trained to have better conversations, let be it. But two things, I go back to Roy and Kimberly: trust and empathy. If we can do that, one of the things that I was reflecting, I want to close your question with this, is a lot of times when we see situations, we talk about, well, did they do it right? Did they do it wrong? And obviously, you know, I want to go back to the last incident of the knee on the neck, because I think it's hard to talk about it, but I wanted to bring it up. I think that as healthcare, there's a lot of times in which we display what being anti-racist is. For example, if somebody comes to our hospital, regardless of who you are, we're going to try to help you. You know, we might have some biases and we hear about them all the time. But if somebody asks you, I cannot breathe, and they come to our hospital, we'll stop anything we're doing to help them out. So what I'm trying to say is, I mean, there's a lot of things that we do great in healthcare, but we're going to have to unlock everybody's potential. And the only way to do that is truly to make sure that everybody feels that belonging to CHRISTUS Health or any other company or our community.
Right. Thank you, Joel. And I think you touched a lot there in the whole inclusion and belonging, which is it's so important. In addition to that, I want to add the issue of just plain diversity as well. I mean, look at your teams. How diverse are they? Do they represent the communities that you serve? You know, look at who are you mentoring? Do they look like you and act like you and behave like you? Who's going to replace you when you retire? We have to be, you know, some of us have been thinking about those things. How does that person look that we're looking at? And let's challenge ourselves. And I think that's really a role for us to always be mindful of those things. So anybody else from the panel would like to add to that? to this question.
I want to ask the group a question. Why are we wearing masks every day? Why are we wearing masks? For those of us who are wearing them, why are we wearing them? It's not a trick question. Why are we wearing it?
Roy, I wear my mask to protect you.
Okay, so it's out of respect for the next person, right?
That's
and
right.
because there is a real threat out there, right? There's a real threat. This coronavirus is a real threat. So I'm going to take it a little bit further and let you guys know that racism is a real threat to our democracy and what we stand for and who we are supposed to be in this world. I'm talking about America. And because we have simply not addressed that issue in this country. So I think now, so with everything going on, the whole idea of being anti-racist really we have to first recognize that it exists and it's real and it's causing real damage to our country. It's like a disease, right? It's causing real damage. We do things to prevent disease from spreading out, right? We talk about how to prevent this, how to prevent that, what steps everybody should take. But the reality is, in regards to racism in this country, a lot of people are just now really waking up to something that has been around as a threat for a population of people since this country has started. So we've never reconciled that. I think the biggest thing we can all do to be anti-racist is to really recognize that racism exists. So, my mother grew up in Bessemer, Alabama, ranked number 13 in the country for number of lynchings in this country. Can you imagine growing up as a child and seeing people pulled out of their houses and lynched in this country? She was born in 1939. On May 7th, 1999, I was pulled out of my car by 2 police officers in New York and slammed to the ground. I have no idea to this day why they did that. The guy stood on my back, the police dog himself, I can still hear and feel the heat from the dog's breath on my neck, right? So if you don't understand that, then there's no way you can be anti-racist if you don't understand that this stuff is happening and it's happening every single day. So I think it's really important for us, where we come from, is we have to understand that this racism in America is a disease, and if we don't do something about this, wherever we are, right, to stop it wherever we are, whether it's putting on the proverbial mask or whatever, to prevent everybody from getting infected by this hate and disease called racism, and we're gonna have real trouble. We just have to recognize it's happening. And I think that's the first thing that everybody should realize when you go to be anti-racist, that it may not happen to you directly. And believe me, I know a lot of African American males who have not had the experience that I have had, and their experience is completely different. But you just have to recognize it's there and it's real and it's a disease. And if we don't cure it, our democracy is going to be in trouble. So that's how I see it. So, thanks.
Thank you, Roy. There's definitely a lot of responsibility.
I would also add, I'm sorry, Marcus. I would also ask, this concept of anti-racism is different from I'm not a racist. We're at a time, I think, where we can't afford to be neutral. And I think that, it's like putting your car in neutral. If you put your car in neutral and you're on a hill, what's going to happen? It's going to roll downhill, right? And so I think that the difference now is that it's not about I'm not a racist. It's needing allies and people to be intentional in saying that this is wrong. This is not acceptable, and this is a systemic problem that requires a systemic solution. And so that goes beyond that. I'm not a racist, or that someone mentioned earlier, I don't see color. Well, how do you get dressed in the morning? Like our who we are, and me being African American woman, that's part of who I am. And so to say that, well, I don't see color, is to completely ignore a a part of my experiences. And so I think that as leaders, we have to get to the part where we're willing to be intentional about how we speak up for others and how we approach these things.
Great. Warren, I know you want to say a couple things. Go ahead.
Yeah, so two questions that I get asked a lot is one, how does anti-racism connect to our mission? And two, how do I identify racism? So Roy mentioned, this is like a pandemic, right? It's not always something, it's in the air, but how do we capture it in a way that makes sense, right? So I want to talk about the two things, both pieces. The first piece is our mission, right? So our mission is to extend the healing ministry of Jesus Christ. And part of that is healing, but the other part of that is justice. Now, if we think about our values, dignity, integrity, all of those are responses to a world that is inherently unjust, right? We wouldn't hold justice and dignity as things to strive for if there wasn't the presence of indignity, which is a result of injustice, right? So when we think about equity, when we think about diversity and inclusion, the reason why we don't have diversity and the reason why we don't have inclusion is because of inequity, is because of injustice, right? So racism connects to the fact that we don't have diversity, the fact that when we go to certain spaces in the organization or elsewhere in the world, that people look certain ways and not other ways, right? Or people don't feel belonging and some people do feel belonging. It's because of the presence of inequity, all right? So when we're thinking about really achieving our mission and really achieving justice, which is extending that healing ministry, it is about being anti-racist. It is about recognizing where that injustice is present and not being non-racist, which is a passive, but being anti-racist, actively living that healing ministry, actively working towards that, right? So the second question is, how do we do that? And what we normally talk about is a framework called LIPS, language, institutions, policies, and symbols. So let's talk about language. As a leader, it's very, very important to think about the language that permeates your space. So for example, in some CHRISTUS facilities, they'll refer to Black women as Medicaid babies, right? And when you really unpack that language, you begin to see how racism is inherently living in that space, right? So changing the language and making it anti-racist is one of the key ways that we can change the culture. The second thing is thinking about policies, both formal and informal policies, right? What kind of policies in terms of who's on the team, employment policies, retention policies, right? But also informal policies. What are the ways in which managerial power doesn't necessarily work on paper, but works in reality, right? Who's in the boardroom and who's not? The third piece is if your team looks like you, it's important to ask questions, why is that the case, right? Why are there barriers to entry for people who are different to yourself? So if your team looks like you, we've spoken about unconscious bias, but unconscious bias is rooted in racism and other forms of oppression, right? It's an outcome of the root cause. The final thing I'd like to say is when we think about symbols, we think about nonverbal and verbal behaviors, right? So when we think about our walls, do they reflect our communities? Or do we only see people that look like ourselves on the walls, right? And something key as a leader is to think about what are the things that are not being spoken about that are very real experiences for your team? And is there a reason why those things are not spoken about? When we have a death, when an associate experiences death, we have a process of grief. When we have some life-changing event, such as a hurricane, we have a process that we work for because we recognize it. But when unarmed Black men and Black people in particular are killed, there's a sense of invisibility that occurs. And those same skills we use for grief, those same skills we use for trauma, are those same skills we can use to build relationships in which people can really feel that their experiences matter and that these situations are not different to other situations in which we have policies and procedures to respond to.
Okay. Thank you, Warren. Just thinking about Catholic healthcare and what is our role what is our role in all this? And, you know, I've had a good conversation with a leader that originally said, well, there's no issues going on here. And then when I asked, is there representation of people of color with the folks that you're talking to? And he said, no, there isn't. And I just kind of like said, okay, I kind of directed him in a different way. But I think we have to have a passion to bring all voices to the room, because that's where issues are going to come up. Just to say, oh no, there's no answers, and then you look in the room and say, well, are those folks that are suffering represented in this table? Well, no wonder you're not hearing issues. That's a reality. I think we have to, this is part of that. And even thinking about the whole pandemic and how it has affected in terms of mortality in particular, the African-American community as well. All those voices need to be there so that we can help improve comorbidities and other things. But we're at a crossroads here. So I'm gonna be very specific. There's some questions that I don't want to miss because you guys submitted them and they're really good questions. So I'm gonna ask one panelist to answer, and the other panelist, I'm sorry, I'm just not gonna give you a chance. And then you can come back, all right? So Kimberly, this one's for you. What is the responsibility of white leaders during times like this? How should we talk with our colleagues, both those who are white and those who are Black and other disenfranchised voices? So what is the responsibility of white leaders? And I think I hear that a lot.
Sure. Well, I think it goes to being an ally. And it goes back to that the leadership of empathy, being able to empathize in a way that, again, this may not be your experience, but I understand, I see you, I hear you, you matter. The other thing I would say is to educate yourself. I've gotten a few text messages from allies and friends, asking, how do I feel about this? Is this okay? Is this offensive? Different things like that. That's all well and good, but there's this thing called Google that works really well. And so there's a lot of resources out there, and I know that Hetty has a lot of resources that are available and more even forthcoming. Educate yourself on these issues, and don't necessarily rely on your Black colleagues and friends to be the educator. We've had to educate ourselves forever on these issues, and so it can be tiresome. So I would say, if you don't feel equipped to have these conversations, use your resources and educate yourselves on these things. And then understand that, again, there's a difference between being neutral or not racist and anti-racist. And so that creates active measures that you would have to do. And so that speaking up when something is said that is inappropriate, doing the things that managers do all the time, working with HR on some of those hard issues that we have, making sure that you're looking at who is on your team and why is that way, and intentionally creating spaces for different people to be a part of your team. So I think all of those things, but really it's about being intentional in whatever in this area.
Great, thank you, Kimberly. Warren, this one's for you. What is the responsibility of Black leaders during times like this? How should we talk to our colleagues, both that are Black and other disenfranchised voices, and those who are white?
I think I can reflect on talking to white leaders, and I may need to defer to our colleagues to talk specifically about what Black leaders can do, because I think Black leaders are facing this not only at work, but in their entire professional and personal life. So I'll talk about white leaders specifically because I can relate, okay? First things first, number one, reflect on yourself, right? How have you thought about these issues before, okay? Secondly, think about the fact that it is your responsibility and your work to do, and not the burden, and don't place that burden on Black colleagues. So for example, it is a form of laziness to go to a Black colleague and say, what should I do? I don't know what I should do. That is both unprofessional because you are a leader. This is your job to solve problems, right? So one of the things that's really helpful, and I've found very helpful in my professional life, is to identify people, particularly white leaders, that I can have these kind of conversations with. Marcus, for example, is one of the people that we reflect with each other before we go out into the public space about how we're going to have a strategy, right? And that's the third piece. It's important to not engage in conversations without really thinking about what your strategy is, right? Is your strategy to listen? Is your strategy to build community? What is it that you are planning to do with this work, right? Reacting right now is important, getting that awareness, reading, learning. There's so many resources out there. Listening. And I'll leave with this final point before I hand it over to one of my colleagues. One of the questions I always get asked is, how do I have difficult conversations with somebody who says things that may be racism denying, right? So they're not necessarily being racist, but racially denying. And I'll give you a quick framework by Dr. David Camp. He says, go into the conversation reflecting on yourself. Secondly, asking questions, really trying to understand and empathizing with the person. Thirdly, connecting. So reflect, ask, connect, and expand. Connect with the person, right? Find a space of connection and then begin to expand their perspective. The challenge is, as leaders, is that we go in expanding without really understanding where our folks are. So we have some resources that are going to walk through that, but I'd like to hand it over to Kimberly or Roy or Yul to take the other piece about what Black leaders could be doing in this time.
This is, well, before you turn it over, there's a reason why I did that, Warren, and I wanted this clear. I asked Kimberly from what is the responsibility of white leaders during times like this as a Black person?
Okay.
What is the responsibility of a Black leader in times like this as a white person? Does that make sense?
Yes, I'm sorry, I never heard that part.
No, that's okay. Don't listen. That's fine. I just wanted to make sure you understood why I did that. There was a reason for that. And I want you to answer it as a white person. Mm-hmm. If you have a Black leader, what do you think what would you tell that Black leader as a white person?
Okay. Well, firstly, let me reflect on myself and say that even though I may have a Black leader, I am still a white person. And so when we go out into the street outside of CHRISTUS, when the police officer comes and racially profiles us, they will not care about the CHRISTUS hierarchy, okay? That Black leader will have a different experience to myself. I am still white, which means something in this experience, right? So the first thing is to really understand that in the workplace, there are going to be experiences that my leader has, right? And expectations that my leader has. One, my leader will probably sense that I do not understand, which in reality, I don't, okay? So what work can I do? What books can I read? What conversations can I have with folks, firstly? Secondly, during this particular time, how can I be a supportive team member? What kind of areas of support that are not necessarily being asked of me, but how can I, in a respectful and appropriate way, pick up some pieces that might be difficult for the leader to hold right now, given everything that is going on. And thirdly, how can I consistently build a relationship, not for the purpose of learning how to be anti-racist from the Black person, no, but how can I build a relationship in which I can authentically learn what it feels like to be led by a Black person? Because even as, you know, Marcus always laughs when I ask people who are interviewing in Hedi is, are you prepared to work for a person of color, right? Because as the white people, in my experience and my personal experience, I have had to learn how to be led by people who do not look like me, because my experience is always being led by people that do. And so those are some pieces that you can consider in this overall context.
Okay, you got it. Thank you. And Kimberly or Roy, I wasn't going to do this, but do you want to add something real quick?
I'll answer real quickly if that's okay.
Yes.
You know, I think recognizing that Black leaders are, you know, we're not leaders when we leave these walls of Christus. We're just, you know, people. And so we're having some of these same experiences or experiencing it through the lens of empathy of others who look like us, who are having these experiences. So one thing I would say is, and this has happened so often that it has become, for me personally, numbing to some extent. And then the recent events with George Floyd, it unnumbed me. And so there's a pain and a hurt that that many people, especially mothers, I think have rallied around, and feeling those feelings over again. So I would say, one, self-care, understanding that, you know, between COVID and social injustice and everything else that's going on in the world, figuring out how to just take care of yourself. The other thing that it means is that, you know, while it's not fair for people to look at you to be the expert on these things, you have to recognize that you are in a unique position to give a voice to these things. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of Black leaders, and that's not particular to Christus. That is, when you look at organizations throughout this country, there's not a lot of Black leaders who are in executive positions or who are board members. And so with that comes a lot of responsibility, and it requires us to sit on panels like this and have these discussions. And so that's why, although I know it's a lot of emotional labor, I was compelled to ask Roy to sit on this panel, and he so graciously agreed to do so. Again, because I think we both recognize that there's a responsibility that we have and a voice that we have to give this conversation. So keep doing the work. Keep doing the work.
Excellent. Well, we have a few more minutes, so I'm gonna jump to the last question. And I don't think, Jamie, I don't think you're gonna give us any more time. So I'm gonna assume that's the answer.
If we can use a few more minutes.
So then I'll take two more questions there, because they're all good.
Yeah.
I might combine some of them, and just let's be brief and hit it hard when we're answering. So couple questions. How can we ensure that we are being inclusive along the lines of diversity, including diversity of thought, beliefs, and background? That's the first one, and I'm going to combine it with the second one. In your opinion, what is the most significant challenge in building an inclusive workforce? And what is the role of the leader in overcoming that challenge? So two things. How can I ensure that I'm building an inclusive culture along the lines of diversity of thought and everything else, race as well? But also, what is the most significant challenge towards achieving that? So if you can break it down in those. And Jewel, do you want to start us with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll start answering the second one. You know, again, from a point of self-reflection, a lot of times we start from doing, you know, what would I do? What have I done in the past? Who am I? When I hire people, a lot of times I can actually say, you know, in Colombia, for example, all of my staff are mostly women, right? I mean, actually, there's only 2 guys and the rest are women. And I love that. I mean, I love the fact that there's diversity. I love the fact that they taught me a lot. But then I think that the key question is, what else am I doing that I could be doing better? In the reality, you know, Marcos, questions like, am I creating mentorship? Am I creating sponsorship? Am I actually seeking diversity in other ways of different types of families? Am I seeking religion? Am I seeking, where you live in the city. And I think a lot of those questions come down to, I go back to how do I ensure that? I think like any leaders, it's about time that we all leaders kind of stop for a while and think about, what is it that I'm intentionally doing every day? I go back to that comment, Marcos, and I think it's not just saying, hey, you know what? I mean, I remember telling HR, hey, I'm diverse. Obviously, we're mostly women in my team, but what else am I doing for that? Is the fact that I have all women a good thing either? I can't. I mean, I go back to we can't just rest without action. We got to do something. We got to seek more and more and more and more.
Absolutely. I think our daily actions, I think number one, we have to be intentional and just know that we're not intentional. These things are not, this change of inclusive culture in our departments is not going to happen organically. The open door policies, then don't use your authority as a means to keep your distance, but actually the opposite, be available, solicit input, those kinds of things. And I can go on and on, but Roy, do you want to touch that one, or Kimberly as well?
I want to quickly say, I'm going to tell you, I know our recruiting staff, our talent acquisition people do a great job, but I am probably the best recruiter out there. I talk to people all the time about coming to work here. I talk to people who have never thought about being a CHRISTUS employee, because I'm looking for that person in the back of the room who never had an opportunity, right? Way in the back. Raise your hand, way in the back, right? So when I go out, I give people my business card, and I try to recruit people that I know in their heart and mind and soul, if given an opportunity, they can do great stuff for us. And that has really worked out in our security staff. We got people out there, women, people of color, white people, everybody who I never thought about being a CHRISTUS armed security officer before, and they're doing a great job for us, but we have to actually go out and find them. The other part is the challenge is, I look at some of our interview panels, and they could use some work, right? So if your interview panel looks like you, talks like you, acts like you, you're not gonna get much out of that, right? So I always try to shake up the interview panels and invite people onto my interview panels that have, that don't know anything about security, don't know anything about a bunch of stuff, but they're just good people with good hearts, and they have different thoughts. And I've learned an awful lot from my interview panels here by having them diverse. One panel prevented me from hiring somebody that I absolutely wanted to hire. And everybody was telling me it was a disastrous hire, but I still like this person. My bias, right? I had to separate that, and unfortunately, I hired the right person, right? So we have to look at those things. So, thanks.
I was going to say, I always want us to remember, because there's consequences of not building an inclusive workplace. And believe it or not, people do not leave organizations. They leave their managers. So don't be fooled. They're not going to say CHRISTUS this, CHRISTUS that. No, it's very personal, and that's 9 out of 10 folks will tell you that when they leave. I don't leave an organization, I leave my manager. So there's a sense of urgency for us to really create this. And one final question, and Kimberly, I'm going to let you take a stab at this first, as kind of an all-encompassing closing us up. What leadership behaviors most contribute to building an inclusive workforce where diversity is truly valued, honored, and respected? So what leadership behaviors most contribute to building that?
One thing that comes to mind, we talked about this earlier with this group, is collaboration. I think that a couple of things, people knowing where you stand on things and being able to collaborate across different parts of the organization. So a very simple, concrete way that I do this is when I'm in a meeting, when I'm in a room meeting with associates, find someone who might be the quiet person in the room, the new person in the room, the only woman in the room, the only minority in the room, whatever it is, and just ask them, so what do you think about this? So it may not be the person that talks all the time or talks the loudest or talks the most often, but those quiet voices help us get diversity of thought. And so, I think that is a very concrete thing that we can all do that creates diversity of thought for the organization. It's so much work to be done, not trying to do it all yourself, but having these conversations with your teams and really curating ambassadors and other people who are willing to share some of this burden and do some of the work as well.
Great, thank you. I love collaboration. Seek that quiet person in the room. I think that it's so, I mean, how can I not sense a sense of belonging here? I think recognition, even public recognition, ensure that you have a diverse slate of candidates for every opening that you have, and expect that. Thinking about the mentoring piece as well. Are you mentoring folks that are different than you? On your regular one-on-ones, you know, offer opportunities for growth, but also strength as well. And little things that I have, for me, have mean a lot. Whether it's, you know, remember birthdays or thank you cards or good mornings and thank yous, and concern for people's families and what's going on in their lives. There's those, again, you know, this is another thing that I always say, is that when it's appropriate, sing people's praises in front of your boss. That will make you look good. So at any rate, and it does a world of difference to those associates that we are leading with our work. All right, any final comments?
I'm gonna say something real quick. As a leader, if you ever find yourself in a room and you ask people for their opinion and it's quiet, that's a reflection of your poor leadership. You have now failed. And that failure is staring you right in the face. You just don't recognize it. So.
Excellent point, Roy. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you so much, panelists. You guys are amazing, all of you, Warren, Jewel, Kimberly, and Roy. And back to you, Jamie. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, thank you all so much for taking your time, and also just taking on, Kimberly and Roy, like the two of you especially, taking on just the emotional burden of having these conversations. And then of course, Warren and Yul sharing your expertise as well, around this and your own experiences. I'm really thankful. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank you, Marcus, for leading the conversation.
You're welcome. Thank you for the invitation. Very timely. Please send us the recording, because we're gonna send this out.
Okay.
All right. Bye bye. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Yeah.